Growing up black in the 1970s meant learning survival skills that have disappeared from modern childhood. Kids mastered abilities that today's generation would struggle to understand, let alone perform. Here are 25 skills from the 1970s that black kids who grew up during this era will never forget. Ironing your own Sunday clothes before church was a non-negotiable skill that every black kid in the 1970s had to learn. There was no sending wrinkled shirts or dresses to school or church, and mothers made sure their children knew how to handle an iron by the time they were old enough to reach the ironing board. Kids learned to test the heat with a damp finger, to spray starch on collars and cuffs, and to press creases into pants that would stay sharp all day. The smell of hot steam and crisp fabric filled bedrooms on Saturday nights as kids prepared their outfits for the next morning. Making a mistake meant scorch marks that ruined good clothes, so concentration was essential. Grandmother supervised the first few attempts, teaching proper technique and the importance of presentation. For black families in the 1970s, looking neat and pressed was about dignity and pride. Kids understood that how you presented yourself to the world mattered, and ironing was the first lesson in taking pride in your appearance. Making Kool-Aid with the perfect sugar ratio was a culinary skill that separated the amateurs from the experts in black households during the 1970s. Every kid had to learn the balance between too sweet and not sweet enough, a formula passed down from older siblings and cousins who had already mastered the art. The process started with the giant pitcher that lived in the refrigerator, the packet of powder dumped in while dry, and the crucial decision of how many cups of sugar to add before the water. Too little sugar and the Kool-Aid tasted watered down and disappointing. Too much and it became syrupy and cloying. Kids stirred with wooden spoons, tasting as they went, adjusting until they hit that perfect spot. The bright red or purple drink was a staple at every gathering, cookout, and after-school snack time. For black kids in the 1970s, making Kool-Aid right was a point of pride. You wanted your pitcher to be the one everyone reached for, and that meant mastering the ratio. Adjusting the TV antenna for better reception was a skill that required patience, coordination, and sometimes a family effort in black households during the 1970s. Before cable television, getting a clear picture meant manipulating the rabbit ear antennas on top of the set or climbing on the roof to turn the outdoor antenna. Kids became experts at holding the metal rods at just the right angle while someone else watched the screen and shouted directions. Moving an inch to the left could mean the difference between a snowy, unwatchable picture and perfect clarity. The frustration of finally getting the picture clear, only to have it go fuzzy again when you let go, was universal. Some families wrapped aluminum foil around the antenna tips, swearing it improved reception. Kids learned to stand perfectly still, sometimes for entire programs, because any movement could disrupt the signal. For black families in the 1970s, adjusting the antenna was a shared ritual that brought everyone together around the television set. Answering the telephone with proper manners was drilled into every black kid during the 1970s because how you spoke reflected on the entire family. When that rotary phone rang, children knew exactly what was expected. You picked up the receiver, spoke clearly, and said something like, "Hello, this is the Johnson residence," or "Good evening, may I ask who is calling, please?" Mumbling, saying yeah or what, or failing to identify yourself was not tolerated. Parents and grandparents monitored those phone conversations, ready to correct any slip in etiquette. Kids learned to take messages accurately, to be polite even when the call was not for them, and to never hang up without saying goodbye properly. The telephone was expensive and important, not a toy to be played with. For black families in the 1970s, telephone manners were part of teaching children to present themselves well in all situations. That skill translated into job interviews, professional settings, and social interactions for the rest of their lives. Taking phone messages accurately on paper was a responsibility that black kids in the 1970s took seriously. Missing information could have real consequences. When someone called for a parent who was not home, children had to write down the caller's name, phone number, reason for calling, and the time of the call. The notepad by the telephone was always ready, along with a pen or pencil that actually worked. Kids learned to repeat numbers back to make sure they got them right, to ask callers to spell difficult names, and to write legibly enough that adults could actually read the message later. A missed message could mean a lost job opportunity, a forgotten appointment, or an angry relative wondering why no one called back. Parents reviewed messages when they got home, and sloppy work was corrected immediately. For black kids in the 1970s, message taking was an early lesson in responsibility and attention to detail that prepared them for more complex duties as they grew older. Reading a road map during family trips was a skill that black kids in the 1970s learned out of necessity because there was no GPS or navigation system to rely on. When families piled into cars for summer road trips or visits to relatives in other states, someone had to navigate using folded paper maps that covered entire regions. Kids learned to trace highways with their fingers, to identify route numbers and interstate symbols, and to calculate distances using the map legend. They announced upcoming exits, warned about construction zones marked on the map, and helped plan rest stops and gas station breaks. Unfolding and refolding those maps correctly was a skill in itself, and a badly folded map could cause chaos in a moving car. For black families driving through unfamiliar areas, especially in the South, having accurate navigation mattered for safety as well as convenience. Kids who mastered map reading became valuable co-pilots on long journeys, sharing the mental load of getting the family to their destination. Telling time on an analog clock instantly was a fundamental skill that every black kid in the 1970s possessed without thinking twice. Digital watches and clocks were rare and expensive, so children learned to read the traditional clock face from an early age. They could glance at a clock and know immediately whether they had 5 minutes or 50 minutes before they had to leave for school. Teachers drilled clock reading in classrooms, and parents reinforced it at home by asking children to check the time throughout the day. Kids understood the relationship between the hour hand and the minute hand, could calculate elapsed time in their heads, and never struggled with phrases like quarter past or half past the hour. Being late because you could not read the clock was not an acceptable excuse in any black household. For today's generation raised on digital displays, reading an analog clock can be surprisingly difficult. But for black kids in the 1970s, it was as natural as breathing and essential for managing their daily schedules. Counting back change in your head was a mathematical skill that black kids in the 1970s developed through constant practice at corner stores and family businesses. When you handed over a dollar bill for something that cost 63 cents, you expected to count out your change before leaving the counter. Kids learned to calculate quickly, adding up from the purchase price to the amount paid, verifying that they received the correct coins. This skill protected against being shortchanged, whether accidentally or intentionally, and built confidence in everyday transactions. Parents sent children to the store with exact instructions and expected them to return with the right items and the right change. Making a mistake meant explaining what happened. Too many mistakes meant losing store privileges. Grandmothers especially emphasized this skill, having grown up in times when every penny mattered even more. For black kids in the 1970s, counting back change was practical math that served them well throughout their lives. Double Dutch jump rope with perfect timing was an athletic and rhythmic skill that black girls especially mastered on sidewalks and playgrounds across the country during the 1970s. Two long ropes turned in opposite directions required split-second timing to enter without tripping, and once inside, jumpers performed tricks, rhymes, and routines that showed off their agility. The turners had their own skill set, maintaining steady speed and rhythm while adjusting to the jumpers' abilities. Neighborhood competitions could last for hours, with girls taking turns showing off increasingly complex moves. Double Dutch required coordination, stamina, and the ability to listen to the rhythm while keeping your feet moving. The rhymes and chants that accompanied the jumping were passed down through generations, each neighborhood adding their own variations. For black girls in the 1970s, Double Dutch was more than a game. It was a cultural tradition that brought communities together on summer afternoons. Hand-clapping games with intricate rhythms were a form of play that black kids in the 1970s perfected through endless repetition and creativity. Games like Miss Mary Mac, Say Oh Playmate, and dozens of regional variations required partners to synchronize their movements while reciting verses that grew faster and more complex with each round. Kids invented new patterns, added their own rhymes, and competed to see who could keep up the longest without making a mistake. The clapping itself was an art form, with palm slaps, backhand taps, and crossbody movements that created percussive sounds and visual displays. Hours passed on front porches and school playgrounds as children practiced and performed these routines. The games taught rhythm, coordination, memory, and social skills all at once. For today's generation, these hand-clapping games might seem simple, but the speed and complexity that black kids achieved in the 1970s would leave most modern children struggling to keep up. Playing outside until the streetlights came on was the universal rule that governed childhood freedom for black kids in the 1970s. When those lights flickered on at dusk, every child in the neighborhood knew it was time to head home, no questions asked. Before that moment, kids roamed freely through blocks and backyards, playing tag, hide and seek, kickball, and games that required nothing but imagination and space. Parents did not worry the way they do today because the whole community watched out for everyone's children. Neighbors would correct misbehavior and send kids home if they strayed too far. The hours between school letting out and the streetlights coming on belonged entirely to children, a time of unsupervised adventure that built independence and resourcefulness. Kids learned to settle their own arguments, organize their own games, and navigate social situations without adult intervention. For black kids in the 1970s, the streetlight rule represented trust and freedom that today's generation of children rarely experiences. Washing dishes by hand without complaint was an expected household duty that black kids in the 1970s performed regularly without expecting praise or reward. Dishwashers were luxuries most families did not have, so after every meal, someone had to wash, rinse, and dry every plate, pot, and utensil used. Kids learned the proper order of operations: glasses first while the water was cleanest, then plates and silverware, and finally the greasy pots and pans. They knew to let cast iron air dry and never use soap on the seasoned skillets. The hot soapy water, the rhythm of scrubbing, and the satisfaction of a clean kitchen became familiar routines. Complaining about dish duty earned extra chores or worse, so children learned to do the work quietly and efficiently. Siblings often worked together, one washing and one drying, turning the task into time for conversation. For black kids in the 1970s, washing dishes taught work ethic, responsibility, and the understanding that everyone contributed to keeping the household running. Darning socks and mending torn clothes was a practical skill that black kids learned because throwing away damaged clothing was not an option for most families in the 1970s. When a sock developed a hole or a shirt seam ripped, mothers and grandmothers pulled out the sewing basket and showed children how to fix it. Darning involved weaving thread back and forth across holes in socks, creating a patch of new fabric that extended the life of the garment. Kids learned to thread needles, tie knots, and make stitches small and tight enough to hold through washing and wearing. Patches were sewn onto the knees of jeans before holes could form, and buttons were replaced as soon as they fell off. The sewing skills passed from generation to generation, with grandmothers teaching mothers who taught children. For Black families stretching every dollar in the 1970s, knowing how to mend clothes was not optional. It was essential survival knowledge that kept families dressed without breaking the budget. Starting the furnace or fireplace safely was a responsibility that older Black kids took on during winter months in the 1970s. Many homes still relied on oil furnaces that required manual lighting or wood-burning fireplaces that provided the main source of heat. Kids learned to check pilot lights, adjust thermostats, and recognize the smell of gas that meant something was wrong. Those with fireplaces knew how to stack kindling and logs properly, how to open the flue to prevent smoke from filling the house, and how to manage a fire safely without letting sparks escape. Mornings often meant waking up to cold houses and being the one responsible for getting heat going before younger siblings got out of bed. The skill required careful attention and respect for the danger involved. Parents trusted their children with this important task because they had been properly trained. For Black families in the 1970s, teaching kids to safely manage heat sources was part of running a functional household. Hand washing delicates and hanging them to dry was a skill that Black kids learned because certain items could never go in the washing machine. Sunday dresses, nice blouses, undergarments, and anything with lace or delicate fabric required gentle hand washing in the bathroom sink or a basin. Kids learned to use cool water, mild soap, and gentle squeezing motions that cleaned without damaging the fabric. Wringing had to be done carefully to avoid stretching or tearing, and items were laid flat or hung on special racks away from direct sunlight, which could fade colors. The process took patience and attention, qualities that children developed through practice. Girls especially learned these skills as they got older and learned responsibility for their own delicate clothing. For Black families in the 1970s, taking care of nice clothes meant they lasted longer and looked better, which mattered when budgets were tight and replacing items was difficult. Sharpening kitchen knives on a whetstone was a skill that Black kids in the 1970s watched their fathers and grandfathers perform with focused precision. A dull knife was dangerous and useless in a kitchen where cooking happened from scratch every single day. The whetstone lived in a special spot, often under the sink or in a drawer, and the ritual of sharpening was almost meditative. Kids learned to hold the blade at the correct angle, to draw it across the stone with steady pressure, and to test the edge carefully on paper or their thumbnail. The sound of metal against stone and the sight of a skilled hand bringing a blade back to life was mesmerizing to young eyes watching closely. Some families passed down the same whetstones through generations, the surfaces worn smooth from decades of use. For those kids, learning to sharpen knives was part of understanding how to maintain and care for the tools that kept the household functioning properly. Canning vegetables and preserving food for the winter was a skill that connected Black kids in the 1970s to generations of ancestors who had survived through careful planning. Summer gardens produced more tomatoes, green beans, and peppers than any family could eat fresh, so the excess was preserved in glass jars that lined pantry shelves. Kids helped wash vegetables, sterilize jars in boiling water, and pack the produce tightly before the lids were sealed. The pressure cooker hissed and rocked as jars processed, and children learned to respect both the equipment and the science behind safe preservation. Mistakes could mean spoiled food or worse, so the process required attention and precision. The reward came in winter months when a jar of home canned tomatoes turned into soup or spaghetti sauce. For Black families in the 1970s, canning was about self-sufficiency and making sure there was always food in the house regardless of what money was available. Cooking a full meal on the stove from scratch was a skill that Black kids in the 1970s developed out of necessity and family tradition. There were no microwaves in most homes, and eating out was a rare luxury, so every meal came from raw ingredients prepared in the kitchen. Kids learned to fry chicken without burning the oil, to simmer greens for hours until they were tender, and to make cornbread that rose golden and perfect. They understood how to manage multiple burners at once, timing everything so that dishes finished together, hot and ready to serve. Grandmothers taught by having children stand beside them, watching and learning before being allowed to take over. A 10-year-old who could prepare Sunday dinner was not unusual, but expected. The skills built confidence and independence while ensuring that everyone in the family could contribute to feeding themselves. For Black kids in the 1970s, cooking was not a hobby, but a fundamental life skill. Pressing hair with a hot comb without getting burned was a skill Black girls learned through careful observation and practice during the 1970s. The metal comb was heated on the stove until it was hot enough to straighten tightly coiled hair, and the process required steady hands and complete concentration. Girls sat in kitchen chairs, heads tilted, while their mothers or older sisters worked, section by section, through their hair. The smell of heated hair grease and the sizzle of the comb became familiar sensory memories. Learning to do it yourself meant mastering temperature control, knowing when the comb was too hot or not hot enough, and developing the coordination to work on your own head using a mirror. Burns on ears, foreheads, and necks were common lessons that taught respect for the tool. For Black girls in the 1970s, mastering the hot comb was a rite of passage that connected them to mothers and grandmothers who had done the same. Hand cranking homemade ice cream at family gatherings was a summertime skill that Black kids in the 1970s remember with fondness and sore arms. The old-fashioned wooden ice cream maker required rock salt, ice, and continuous cranking to transform cream, sugar, and vanilla into a frozen dessert. Kids took turns at the handle, their arms growing tired as the mixture thickened and the crank became harder to turn. The anticipation built with every rotation, knowing that the reward for all that work was the first taste of fresh, creamy ice cream, still soft from the churn. Cousins competed to see who could crank the longest without stopping, turning the labor into a game that everyone wanted to win. The adults added the rock salt and ice, managing the technical aspects, while children provided the muscle power. For Black families in the 1970s, homemade ice cream was a special treat reserved for reunions, cookouts, and holiday celebrations where the whole family gathered together. Memorizing phone numbers by heart was a mental skill that Black kids in the 1970s developed because there was no other way to reach the people who mattered. Before cell phones stored contacts automatically, every important number had to live in your head. Kids memorized their home number first, then grandparents, aunts, uncles, and best friends. They could recite those numbers without hesitation. The digits burned into memory through constant repetition. Knowing phone numbers was a safety issue too. If you got lost or needed help, you had to be able to reach your family from any payphone. Parents drilled these numbers into children from an early age, testing them randomly to make sure they still remembered. The rhythm of the numbers became almost musical, a pattern that stayed with you for life. Many adults who grew up in the 1970s can still recite their childhood phone numbers decades later. For Black kids of that era, memorizing numbers was not a chore, but a necessity that connected them to the people they loved. Braiding hair in cornrows and intricate plaits was a skill that black girls learned at their mothers' and grandmothers' knees during the 1970s. The process could take hours, with the child sitting on the floor between the legs of whoever was doing the braiding, head tilted and held still while nimble fingers worked through sections of hair. Girls learned to part hair evenly, to grip strands tightly without pulling too hard, and to weave patterns that ranged from simple straight back styles to elaborate designs. The skill required patience on both sides, the braider and the one being braided. As girls got older, they practiced on dolls, younger siblings, and friends until they could create styles that rivaled what the adults produced. Braiding was more than just hair care. It was bonding time, conversation time, and a passing down of cultural tradition. For black girls in the 1970s, learning to braid connected them to generations of women who had done the same, fingers moving in patterns older than memory. Writing thank you notes in perfect cursive was a social skill that black kids in the 1970s learned because expressing gratitude properly reflected on the entire family. After birthdays, holidays, and any occasion where gifts were received, children sat down with pen and paper to write personalized notes to each person who had given them something. The handwriting had to be neat, the spelling correct, and the message sincere. Mothers and grandmothers inspected every note before it was mailed, sending back any that were sloppy or too brief. Kids learned the proper format, opening with a greeting, mentioning the specific gift, explaining how they would use it, and closing with warm regards. The cursive writing itself was an art that required practice, with loops and curves flowing smoothly across the page. For black families in the 1970s, thank you notes were not optional, but required expressions of good home training. The skill taught children that acknowledging kindness mattered. Reciting Bible verses and hymns from memory was a spiritual discipline that black kids in the 1970s practiced regularly because faith was woven into the fabric of daily life. Sunday school teachers assigned verses to memorize, and children stood before congregations to recite them without notes, their voices carrying words that had been passed down through generations. The verses became part of who they were, surfacing in moments of trouble, joy, and uncertainty throughout their lives. Hymns learned in church were sung at home, in the car, and at family gatherings, the melodies and lyrics embedded so deeply that they never faded. Grandmothers would start singing and everyone would join in. No hymnals were needed because the words lived in their hearts. For black families in the 1970s, scripture memorization was not just religious education. It was survival, comfort, and connection to ancestors who had held on to faith through the hardest times. Those verses and hymns became anchors that children carried with them forever. Caring for younger siblings while parents worked was a responsibility that shaped the character of black kids in the 1970s in ways that still resonate today. With both parents often working multiple jobs and daycare being expensive or unavailable, older children became second parents to their brothers and sisters. They walked younger siblings to school, prepared after-school snacks, helped with homework, and kept everyone safe until the adults came home. The weight of that responsibility taught maturity far beyond their years. Kids learned to handle emergencies, settle arguments, and provide comfort when little ones were scared or hurt. They changed diapers, heated bottles, and sang lullabies before they were old enough to drive. For many black kids, caring for siblings was not a burden, but a badge of honor, proof that their families trusted them with what mattered most. Those lessons in responsibility, sacrifice, and love created bonds between siblings that lasted a lifetime. Which of these skills hit closest to home? Drop a comment, hit like, and subscribe to keep these memories alive.